Dr. Dalton Humphrey is a research assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State. His research program focuses on improving nutrient efficiency and requirement estimations in pigs through mechanistic understanding of amino acid and energy metabolism. He studies how nutrient interactions and physiological demand influences performance across production stages. His work aims to deliver science-based feeding strategies that support efficient, resilient, and sustainable swine production. Please help me and welcome to the stage Dr. Dalton Humphrey.
Thanks for the introduction, Matt, and thanks to all of you for being here today. So nutrient utilization efficiency was the title of my talk, and obviously a huge topic. Could write multiple books on it. I couldn't personally, but people could, right? And so I had to whittle that down a little bit, and I wanted to relate it to some work that we've been working on in the group through some collaboration with Drs. Brian Kerr and Stephen Tribue at the USDA, and then Dr. Scherson at the University of Minnesota. And as part of that collaboration, we've been working on a modeling framework to quantify and track carbon flow through the pig. And so in this case, I want to present carbon flow as a way or a framework to understand opportunities to improve nutrient utilization efficiency. And we're going to focus most of the talk from the carbon perspective on growing pigs. So why does nutrient utilization efficiency matter? I think that's an important place to start with all topics, right? Pretty obviously, we've all heard this statistic that feed cost is the primary input cost of production. Typically, we throw out the 60 to 70% of input cost is covered by feed. And so from a nutrition perspective, our real goal is to maximize the amount of nutrients from feed that animal is consuming that ultimately ends up into productive output. So lean tissue deposition, some lipid deposition, et cetera, ultimately the end product to the consumer. All while obviously being economically optimal in doing that. So throwing that out there as something that's always in the back of our mind. And so if we think about kind of the general big picture pathway of nutrient utilization, I split it up into a couple steps here. And so nutrient supply, obviously what we provide that pig is important, that we're providing them enough and not in excess to optimize nutrient utilization efficiency. Those nutrients have to be digested and absorbed. And then ultimately, kind of the piece that I think we can dive a little bit more in detail by using this carbon framework is utilization. So after it's absorbed, then what really is happening post-absorption to determine where that nutrient ends up. Is it being retained in productive output, which is the goal? And if it's not, where is it going, right? And so ultimately understanding nutrient fate, so where it's going in that pathway, is really pivotal when we're trying to improve nutrient utilization efficiency. And so when we think about this pathway, we can probably relate to a lot of these steps, right? At least us nutritionists in the group. Nutrient supply, in my mind, has a lot to do with requirement estimation, understanding ingredients and ingredient characteristics, feed processing, etc. Digestion and absorption, that can go all the way from health and management of the pigs to maybe feed technologies like enzymes, proper characterization, again, of ingredients, and also characterization of those ingredients and enzymes, etc., throughout the lifetime of the pig and how that changes. Utilization becomes a little bit more abstract, right, because it's a lot more metabolic and a lot of things can interact there that ultimately determine that. And then ultimately retention, end product in the pig. And so what are common metrics if we think about how we today practically try to understand nutrient utilization? And so from a real world perspective, a lot of times we're thinking about growth performance, right? So average daily gain provides us an indicator of kind of the total quantity of nutrients that are being retained by the pig, not necessarily what proportion they consumed. Feed efficiency gives us some insight there on what amount of those nutrients ultimately ended up retained. So proportionally, how efficient are they? The missing piece with efficiency from a utilization standpoint is We may be able to have an estimate of how much is not retained, but we don't know of what was not retained, where did that end up, and why wasn't it retained. We can think about nutrient digestibility, and that ultimately has to do with nutrient availability in that utilization pathway. And then more on the research side, we'll sometimes quantify nutrient retentions. I threw out nitrogen retention as a common metric we might look at in studies, and that's kind of an indicator of an individual nutrient class utilization, protein utilization. And then ultimately, carcass composition can give us kind of a handle on kind of more definitively which nutrients were being retained. And so all these metrics are obviously super important. We will continue to use them today, for sure, but they all give kind of single components of that nutrient utilization pathway. And so ultimately, when we talk about nutrient partitioning or nutrient utilization, we're going to talk post-absorption, so after it's digested and absorbed by the animal. There's really one of three things that can happen once a nutrient gets to that point. The animal can use it and retain it for productive purposes, for muscle deposition, lipid deposition. That nutrient may be oxidized, whether for essential purposes, maintenance, or non-essential purposes. Maybe there's excess nutrients that pig's going to oxidize and then ultimately excrete. And then there's excretion. That can be coupled with oxidation, but it can also be pre-absorption, right, on that digestibility piece. That which is not absorbed or digested ends up excreted. And so when we think again of this whole pathway of nutrient utilization, it really becomes, when we think about how do we improve it, it becomes a nutrient partitioning question. What can we do to alter the amount of nutrients proportionally that ends up in one of these three, what I'll call pools: retained, oxidized, or excreted? And so then the question is, why carbon? Why are we using carbon today as an example or framework to try to think through this process? And it's not because we necessarily, in this example, have a specific interest in carbon itself. But what carbon does and why we're using it is because it allows us to, at a high level, integrate across multiple nutrients, multiple of the organic nutrients that we as nutritionists care about every day, right? And so we all learn an organic compound contains nitrogen. So of the three major nutrient classes we'll talk about, proteins, carbs, and lipids all contain carbon. And so while we can track individually maybe, or attempt to track individually these three classes, to get a more high-level view, we can just use carbon because it's a common currency that'll go across all three of these nutrients. And so tracking carbon flow kind of gives us that framework. And so ultimately that allows us then to try to partition the different pieces of that utilization pathway across these three nutrient classes to understand where it's all going. And this is really, at the end of the day, I call it high level, big picture. It's a complement to the existing type of frameworks we already use. Energy utilization, amino acid, nitrogen-based approaches. Those are a little more refined in terms of focusing on specific pieces. Carbon's a little more high level and kind of across nutrients. And so, again, this was a collaborative effort between myself, a couple of members at the USDA and the University of Minnesota. And so I wanted to spend a couple of seconds kind of explaining how we went about setting up this modeling approach of carbon flow. And so obviously all starts with inputs, so feed carbon. And so surprisingly enough, carbon's easy to measure. It's a similar technique that we use for crude protein, but it's not something we commonly measure. And so we were thankful Dr. Brian Kerr and all his years of work had a substantial database sitting on his computer that had never seen the light of day of ingredient carbon levels. And so we put together a database of 80 common feed ingredients and what those expected carbon concentrations would be. And that allows us then to at least start with understanding what carbon input might look like in a typical scenario we'd see today. Obviously, that needs continued updating, added ingredients, etc. I think there's opportunity to then understand predicting carbon rather than measuring it. But for this purpose, we had a database to work with. We then had to go to the next step. So kind of going through that pathway again, first loss in that pathway would be fecal carbon loss. So what is not digested by the animal. And so we took a couple approaches to do that. And so our first relationship that we defined to use in this modeling approach was to relate carbon digestibility to gross energy digestibility. And so we'd expect that that relationship would be there. Almost all carbon-containing compounds that will burn or release energy would contain carbon. And so we'd expect there'd be a relationship. There's, again, not a lot of data out there in the literature relating carbon digestibility, but we were able to pull together 7 studies of published literature that measured both carbon digestibility and energy digestibility. And as we kind of expected, there was a very strong relationship, and so then we could then go from feed carbon based on energy digestibility to get a digestible carbon number. Alternatively, if we again think of the relationship between carbon and energy, Dr. Kerr and all his data on his computer that he has sitting there also had 800 observations from metabolism studies he's done over the last 20 years. And so we were able to pull that, again, because he was one of the unique individuals who has measured carbon over time because of his interest in emissions earlier in his career at the USDA. And again, if we instead use fecal gross energy output, we can then predict fecal carbon output very, very well. So 2 different approaches ultimately to accomplish the same goal, to understand how much carbon is being lost through the fecal, ultimately to calculate how much is then digestible by the animal. Next step in that pathway, once kind of digested, one of the next loss pathways could be urinary carbon. That's going to relate to protein utilization, right? If we think about carbon going across nutrients, this is where protein kind of comes into the picture. This would be either protein turnover, maintenance, or just excess protein that we're feeding in the diet, results in carbon loss, nitrogen loss. So again, we can take multiple approaches. We can relate it to nitrogen loss in the urine, or we can relate it to energy. For this purpose, I'm presenting the energy approach today. And again, use the same pigs that we used for the carbon loss in fecal to estimate carbon loss in urine. So skipping kind of to the end for a second, because it's going to circle back to the last piece. And so retained carbon. So how much is being retained by that pig? This one is a little more challenging. And so we have to have a couple different things. We have to have a body composition estimate, a growth curve of that composition, so protein deposition and lipid deposition curves, which I'll throw a pitch in now. That's a point of data that I think we need to update in the literature. There's not a lot of recent data on modern genetics looking at those curves. And so thankfully we had some empirical data that we had from pigs that were ground and chemically analyzed at Iowa State over the years, and so we use that as our database to develop lean and protein and lipid deposition curves over the full growth period. And so we use that data to develop protein and lipid deposition curves for just this model purposes. Obviously, those could be updated with more relevant or more modern genetic curves. And then we had to estimate, okay, what's the carbon composition of that? And so Dr. Kerr went through an extensive process of reviewing amino acid profiles of muscle and fatty acid profiles of lipids, and ultimately we came up with the estimates that body protein is about 44.5% carbon, lipid is about 76% carbon. And so if we do that and use our estimates from the actual pigs we measured, we see that by taking the approach of using the composition of fat carbon and protein carbon, we can accurately predict whole body carbon of the pig. Then the last piece is gaseous carbon loss. And so this one's a little more abstract. And so gaseous carbon loss can occur through CO2, so breath. That's a result of some sort of oxidation of nutrients happening in the pig. There's a lot of discrepancy in methods in the literature on how we can go about this, and so we tested multiple. They came to pretty similar conclusions. Today I'm presenting a method that we actually kind of developed ourselves internally that we're calling the net oxidation method. And so if we understand the nutrients retained in the pig, the amount of lipid and protein deposition occurring, the intake of digestible protein and digestible lipid, we can then calculate the energy retained in those in that pig, and then estimate proportionally how much protein, lipid, carbs then had to be oxidized for heat production, end up relating that back to CO2. Complicated method, but that's how we came to, and we felt that relating it to basically indirect calorimetry methods. And then, although much smaller than ruminants, there is some methane loss in pigs. Ultimately, we just used a published equation for that from Jorgensen et al. And related it back to dry matter intake. So that's kind of the general framework, how we got to the modeling approach we did, and how to estimate the inputs and outputs of that carbon flow model. And so now just going to show you an example. If we apply that to kind of a real world commercial grow finish pig setting, what do we see, and where all those carbon, or where do the nutrients end up? And so we use just a commercial growth curve here. We started at kind of the last phase of the nursery, so about 12 kilos, and went to market, so 136 kilos. This is just a growth curve. And so points between that was the time of the phases that we simulated, feed phases. We assumed an average daily gain of 0.87 kilos, just over 2 kilos of feed intake, and about 142 days on feed. And so diet average crude protein is about 16, metabolizable energy just over 3.3 mcals. And from a carbon composition standpoint, the diets on average were about 40% carbon. And that's based on our ingredient database that we compiled from Dr. Kerr's data. Just quickly, I'm not going to go through a lot of the details. We just used what we considered a pretty representative set of diets for commercial production today. They have some DDGs, corn, soy, synthetic amino acids, etc. Again, 6 phases, last phase of the nursery, and 5 grow finish feeding phases. Okay, so where did the carbon end up when we took that approach and then quantified each component of that nutrient utilization pathway that I explained? And so over the course of that pig's grow finish period, it consumed 122 kilos of carbon itself. Carbon was about 86% digestible in those diets on average, resulting in about 14% lost in fecal, and then again 86% that could be digested and absorbed. Urinary carbon, as we kind of expect, because we balanced a lot of the amino acids and nitrogen in those diets that we formulated, was pretty low. We lost only about 2% in the diet from urine. Respired carbon, so this is just CO2 loss here, was by far and away the biggest component of carbon loss. About 56% of the carbon the pig consumed was lost through respiration. Obviously, that's to some extent a required process. We'll talk about some of the opportunities we think could be there. And that all left with about 25% of the carbon the pig consumed being retained in its body as muscle and lipid. And so diving into a little bit of the components of that retention. So if we look here on the left, here is just the protein and lipid deposition curves based on our relationship with body weight, lipid and protein composition that we estimated from the pigs that we had data on. So this is what it ended up for this pig. And so as we expect, protein deposition increases, hits a max and kind of plateaus. Lipid deposition starts increasing over protein deposition late. Interestingly, if we look at that relative to instead just protein and lipid deposition, if we look at protein carbon and lipid carbon deposition, we see that lipid carbon deposition dominates for the entire growth period, and that's simply a reflection that lipids contain 76% carbon versus the 44% that's in protein. But also that difference in protein and lipid carbon gets bigger as the pigs get heavier. And so the next question is, this is the entirety of the growth period. This is kind of the efficiency that we see in this scenario with these diets. And so the question is, what does it look like at individual phases of that pig, and how does efficiency change? And so nutrient utilization efficiency, what we saw is not constant. I think that's intuitive to most of us, and it declines as pigs grow. And so here, we're in the carbon framework, so we're talking about carbon use efficiency, but again, thinking generally about nutrient efficiency and carbon being that framework to look at that. We see that efficiency starts at that last phase of the nursery at about 32% and drops just under 10% by the time they're marketed, down to 23% efficiency. And that efficiency number is just the amount that they retained divided by how much they consumed. Again, this is expected intuitively. If we think about feed efficiency, we'd expect the same response here, right? And so this doesn't provide a lot of new information that we wouldn't already expect from efficiency. We know that from feed efficiency. And so what the question then is, of that reduction and those losses that are occurring, where's it going and why is that loss happening? And so instead of looking at overall efficiency, we can look at the different partitions of the losses throughout the pig's life and break that up into the fecal, urinary, respiration, and retention of carbon. And so really we see here that fecal in green and urine in yellow. Again, those are small proportions of the loss. They slightly increase over time, but in the grand scheme, relatively constant. Retention also increases. We saw that with the protein and lipid deposition curves. Again, we're looking at the thickness of these lines and how they change. That changes, but by far and away, again, respiration is the greatest component, and the increase in respiration losses is increasing faster than retention. And so ultimately, that respiration loss is driving most of our reduction in nutrient utilization efficiency. And so the question is, what components go into that respiration loss, right? Pigs obviously have to breathe. It's nothing we can completely remove. But the big question is, of what drives respiration losses, what can be mitigated or modified to help drive more nutrients toward retention rather than loss? And so this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I just threw some things out there that I think we can relate to that could affect the way nutrients are utilized by the pig. Things like maintenance energy costs. And a lot of these really should have arrows going to all of the boxes because they interact in some way, right? Activity, stress, health, disease, inflammation. This can all affect mostly maintenance requirements, which ultimately results in nutrient oxidation and then carbon loss through respiration. And so again, what are the opportunities then that we can do and help mitigate some of these losses to allow some of the nutrients that would be lost through these pathways to be retained by the pig? And I don't have all the answers or maybe any of the answers here. A lot of opportunity for research ongoing has been, right, in the health space and everything. And so at the end of the day, what does this framework allow us to look at? And then what are things that are beyond the scope of this framework that we need to start thinking about and continue looking into? And so through this, we can generally look at nutrient partitioning across kind of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, right? And look at generally where are those being partitioned and lost within the pig. We can understand retention, excretion, and then overall use efficiency. But then as we understand that, we need to start getting deeper to then answer the question of what can we change to improve. And so we need to start understanding tissue-specific nutrient uses. And so in certain physiological states, maybe certain tissues are dominating nutrient utilization. If we can more appropriately feed that pig to provide those nutrients to that tissue, that allows some options. What are those drivers of nutrient oxidation? I showed all of these, but we really need to quantify them. What is the impact of it? How much does PERS affect maintenance energy costs? And what can we then do to help mitigate that loss? How can nutrition shift the nutrient partitioning? If we can feed a pig more precisely, meet its requirements, we'd expect that more proportionally of those nutrients would be retained. And then I think a big area that we need to continue understanding is variability, right? I just showed you a simulation of one pig. there's a lot of variation that exists in every step of the process that I talked about, and understanding that is key. And so that's kind of where we're at framework-wise and what we think we can ascertain from that. We ended that respiration's a big loss, right? And so I wanted to talk just briefly about a couple examples that I think start to get at some of those questions we can start answering to help understand that process. And so some future directions. I think one of the biggest things we can do from a nutrient utilization standpoint is continue to refine our requirement estimates for pigs. Update the ones that are old and understand the ones that we don't understand at all, right? Because on either end of the spectrum, if we're shorting that pig nutrients, they're not going to be optimal in the way they're using all the other nutrients they're consuming. On the other end, if we're feeding excesses, those are just going to be lost, right? That's not efficient economically. It's not efficient for the pig biologically. And when we look at these things, we historically tend to look at them in single, right? We'll look at lysine requirements, threonine requirements, et cetera. And I think we need to start understanding more of the interactions that occur with these nutrients and how they can affect utilization of each of them. And so thinking kind of big picture, amino acids interacting with each other, energy interacting with amino acids, fiber and amino acids. We know that threonine and requirement and fiber content in the diet are different, right? And so this is just a quick example of kind of demonstrating that concept of amino acid interactions affecting utilization efficiency. And so this is a study we did a couple years ago on branched chain amino acids, so valine, leucine, and isoleucine. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details, just demonstrate the point. And so those three amino acids are metabolically interconnected. We know that. And so because they're metabolically interconnected, because they're broken down in the body through the same pathway. And so if you provide an excess of one of those three, the body's just going to break down all three of them. And so we tested that concept in nursery pigs. And so this is just a quick surface response plot. And so down here on this axis in the bottom right, I have the leucine levels of the diet and isoleucine on the opposite. And then average daily gain kind of is the response here that we're looking at. And so if we look at what happens when we change these two amino acid levels, we see that if we have a low level, low relative to low meaning at the requirement estimate for leucine, and a high level of isoleucine, so if we increase isoleucine above the requirement, we actually got a beneficial response to growth. And so there's an improvement in some way of nutrient utilization and retention in that scenario. But in the opposite spectrum, if we leave isoleucine as high as it was in that improved growth scenario, and we also increase leucine along with it, we pretty severely reduced average daily gain, indicating that there is that metabolic interaction between these. And so just looking at one of them in single wouldn't provide that picture of that there is this utilization change. And then lastly, thinking more towards the tissue specific, we've been talking grow finish, but I wanted to touch on sows very quickly because I think this is a good example of when a single type of tissue or organ is dominating production, right? Lactation. We just heard about it from Hyatt. The mammary gland is obviously using most of the nutrients in lactation. And so understanding the needs of that dominant tissue will help us more in a refined way provide the pig what, in this case, she needs for lactation. And so this is a project we've been working on for a couple years, collaboration with the vet school and field services and the SMEC team here on campus. And this is just a snapshot of some data from that. And so we actually catheterized sows and are working on, we've measured what that mammary gland is taking up in terms of nutrients, how is it utilizing them, and then what's going out in milk. So quantifying exactly how much of nutrients that mammary gland needs and that sow needs. This is just an example of glucose uptake by the mammary gland. And so thinking not only do we need to understand that partitioning is tissue specific, it's also dynamic, so it's changing with time, right? And so the more refined we can get in that dynamic change, the more accurate we can be in providing nutrition to that animal. So here we see almost a 2.5-fold increase in glucose uptake by the mammary gland from late gestation, she's starting to make colostrum, to kind of late lactation before weaning. And so with that, I appreciate you guys being here today and the attention. Quickly thank some of the people that contributed to this work. Again, Dr. Brian Kerr, Dr. Schurston, and Tribune, and then the funding contributions for some of the projects they talked about that today. So with that, I'll take any questions.